my Belinda, your Belinda, whoever's Belinda it may be, welcome to your Belinda, California, where today we are going to be talking about Nixon before Watergate. So you can see the Presidential Museum behind me there, and once they open, we will go see a couple of things. We'll see where Nixon was born, we will see where he is buried, and get a look around the grounds of the Presidential Library. So, while we're waiting for all that, I thought we would talk about a lesser known part of former President Nixon's life. And that would be his time before the great tragedy of Watergate brought down his presidency. This is a person who lived 60 plus years of their life prior to what we mostly know him for today, that being Watergate. So let's get started here with this whole area, right? And how it relates to the Nixons. They bought the property that we're walking on right now, and his father built their house, which we will see on that property. And they also basically ran a lemon ranch from this place that you're seeing around here right now. So Nixon grew up, little kid amongst the lemon trees, and he had a couple of brothers, and two of them ended up dying from tuberculosis. So this was something, and especially Harold, his brother Harold, really lived for quite a long time before he died of tuberculosis. And Richard Nixon, sort of watching this as he's a little kid, seeing his brothers get sicker and sicker, I think that from an early age sort of made him realize this whole concept of you never know what's going to happen in life, and you just have to really go out there and sort of get into it and grab and do whatever it is that you want to do. And he certainly did lead a life in those terms. That first family pursuit of lemon ranching didn't seem to go all that well, and Nixon's parents did go on to purchase a small grocery store / gas station not too far away in a town called Whittier, California. And Dick and his brothers, as teenagers, of course, would help out working in the family grocery store. And being quite a good student and a very intelligent person, Nixon did have the opportunity to attend Ivy League universities. However, not being a person who came from a wealthy family, he probably was middle class at best. He decided to attend a local little college called Whittier College, and after graduating there, he did then move farther afield and attended Duke University Law School. So while Duke is not exactly an Ivy League place, it is certainly, their law school is quite competitive, and Nixon earned a nickname while at Duke, and his nickname was Iron Butt. And this sort of reveals one of his early proclivities that would stay with him throughout his life, which was that he was really into preparation, and he would just sit and he would just grind it out and study and prepare as a way of sort of being able to compete at the same level of others around him who may have been more skilled in things like soft skills or had more charm or good looks. He started to use preparation and just this grinding out study to essentially be at the same level and compete at the same level as some of those more Kennedy-esque folks, right, who he will run across later in life. So having graduated from Duke, he's got a pretty good future ahead of him here, but then one big old war comes along and into his life, as it did into so many of his generation. And something I haven't mentioned yet, but very important, is that Nixon's family were Quakers. So think of the oatmeal box. That's what we're talking about here. He and his parents belonged to a religious movement which the Quakers were sort of conscientious objectors to serving in the military, and Nixon could have pursued a sort of like an exception, being a birthright Quaker, as they called it, and tried to not have to serve in the war, but he actually did the opposite. So it's kind of weird. Why would he volunteered for the Navy in World War II? And a lot of people kind of wonder, why would he do that? I think there's kind of two aspects to it. First, I think he had enough foresight to realize that his generation was just going to be full of these sort of hero-like figures who had served in this huge war. And if he wasn't among them, it would probably be quite limiting in terms of his career and his future, especially in anything related to politics. And so this volunteering for the war kind of took the whole Quaker religious thing off the table and put it in his past. And secondly, I think that he did have a certain bravery aspect to his personality, and was just a naturally very, very brave person who would sort of sometimes put his own personal physical well-being aside. And he sort of enjoyed the concept of the dice are in the air and what's going to happen. So this service in the Navy was not an especially dangerous assignment. He was a low-level officer and served on a number of little islands in the Pacific out in the middle of nowhere, working in what we might call logistics. How are we going to get this from here to there type of thing? So I mentioned that Nixon was from a Quaker family, and he also was quite the poker player during his days in World War II. Won a lot of money, and again, really just grinding it out was one of his specialties. And so he's kind of interesting here because we've got a gambling Quaker. He also had quite the taste for alcoholic beverages, so we have ourselves a drinking Quaker. And it would not be too hard to show that he was also a swearing Quaker. We would only have to look at some of the Nixon tapes to realize that this was one potty-mouthed president. And so we've got this Quaker aspect, and then these sort of contradictions with that, which tell you that this is not just a one-trick pony. This is a person who has a very dynamic personality. So one of the aspects of Nixon's life had already been, when he was in college, this concept of being very participatory. And so he was always trying to participate in different clubs, different activities, different sports. Even though he wasn't a natural athlete, he would always try to participate on these teams. And it appears to be that he recognized early on the value of connections, especially for somebody who was not from a wealthy or influential family. He seems to realize pretty early that the way for him to sort of get into these positions that he's interested in is going to be through connections. And so he's back here in Orange County after the war, and pretty quickly he's already made enough, at least local connections with people of means and influence, that he's able to not only run for the U.S. House of Representatives, supposedly doing so partly with money he won playing poker in the Navy, but also backed by some of these local influencers. And he's able to not only run at a very young age, but to win his freshman position in the House of Representatives when most people would just be sort of starting out in whatever career they're going to have. So as a very young congressman, Nixon makes a national name for himself quite early on. He was a member of a controversial committee called the House Un-American Activities Committee. And as part of his work there, he was very doggedly pursuing a guy by the name of Alger Hiss. And Alger Hiss was a State Department employee who was accused of being a Soviet spy. And Nixon was really going after this guy, but nobody could ever really prove that Hiss was this spy until Nixon finally got the dirt that proved it. And as a result of this, Nixon became sort of a nationally known figure, and also became more well known within his Republican Party as a young up-and-coming person who's going places. And so General Eisenhower is getting ready to run for president, and he starts thinking, why don't I consider this young up-and-coming Republican Richard Nixon as my vice presidential running mate? And they did move forward with that. Nixon would become the second youngest vice president in American history, but it nearly didn't work out because Nixon faced a big disaster, more disastrous than even the leaf blowers and chainsaws coming up. So this big disaster right away, as soon as Eisenhower picks him as his running mate, is that it was discovered in the media that Nixon had a slush fund where he kept secret funds. And while this was not technically illegal, it looked very bad, and the press was really beating him up. So this is kind of the first inklings that we see of Nixon's very sour relationship with the media, a mutually sour relationship that would continue. He's not revving the saw. There we go. So Nixon gets himself into deep water pretty quick here. Ike's thinking, I might have to dump this guy. And Nixon saves himself by going on national television and sort of laying bare his personal finances for the whole country to see. And he takes this approach of basically saying, look, I'm a person of average means just like you guys are. My wife doesn't wear a fur coat. She wears a proper Republican cloth coat. And then he got into the checkers stuff, which is what this speech, of course, is known as, is the checkers speech. And he said, look, we received a gift, this little dog, and we've come to really like the little dog, and we're keeping the dog. This whole concept of him being a little bit like pushing back and saying, look, I'm just a normal guy here, actually won him a lot of sympathy among Americans who were watching him on TV. And so he was able to save himself mainly by sort of circumventing the people in the media and taking his appeal directly to the American people. So whoever invented the leaf blower would have an interesting relationship with modern day YouTubers. Kind of like that Nixon and the media relationship. So he's vice president, and two things of note happened during this time. So first of all, as I mentioned, Eisenhower's getting elderly, his health isn't great, and so he decides that rather than traveling the world himself, he's going to use Nixon as sort of like his personal representative out in the world representing the United States. And so Nixon and his wife Pat become huge travelers as vice president. They'd been big travelers even before so, and seemed to really like sort of traveling together. And they really got a lot of time out on the road working for Eisenhower. And one time when they had quite a dangerous situation, once again, Nixon seems to have in his personality a certain attraction to danger. And they were in South America. There was a crowd that was protesting their appearance, and they became sort of surrounded by this angry crowd who were throwing rocks and sort of like jostling their car around, breaking out windows. And it got quite serious to the point where they just barely, it would appear, just barely made it out of there without something really, really major happening, a very tense situation. So that kind of, again, highlights Nixon's kind of bravery and thrill of the dice being in the air, and that kind of aspect to his personality that he seemed maybe sort of somewhere in the background to actually kind of seek out or enjoy. But the other thing we have to note about his vice presidency was his participation in something known as the kitchen debate. So Eisenhower sent Nixon off to Moscow to attend an event with then head of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev. And Khrushchev was quite a trained debater and could be sort of a confrontational character. And he got into it with Nixon verbally in this thing known as the kitchen debate, where they were advocating their sides in the Cold War. Nixon advocated for capitalism and Khrushchev for communism. And it was seen as Nixon, who'd always been quite a good debater, did reasonably well in this very heated discussion, and again sort of got him more national attention and prominence within his party, to the point where people were thinking, this young vice president might actually really be able to be a full-fledged president himself. Well, we continue to wait for the presidential property to open this morning, but the school bus is already lining up. Let's talk about Kennedy Nixon. This is Nixon's first attempt at being president, and a very narrow loss. I think we can point to two items that help explain why he couldn't quite make it on his first try. So the first thing is that I think it could be a little bit of a klutz sometimes, and during the campaign he very seriously injured his knee in an incident with a car door, getting into a car, and ended up in the hospital and had quite a major health scare as a result of this knee injury. And this was right before he would go in front of the cameras with Kennedy in their famous first debate. And people always kind of point to that, right? Television's now coming into its own, and you have to appear well in front of those cameras. Kennedy looked very sort of vibrant, and Nixon, for his part, appeared to be sort of gaunt and sickly looking. And so his appearance on that debate definitely did not do him any favors. The second thing I would like to point to, though, is maybe lesser known, and that is that he made a very unfortunate promise in the campaign that he would visit all 50 states during the campaign, which, as we know, is not a good idea, because most states they're already decided, right? It's only the close states that you have to really focus on, laser beam attention, and that was known even at that time. And so this promise to be bouncing around to all 50 states when all he's doing is kind of scattering his energies, when he really needed to be focusing those energies and resources on those few key swing states. And so that's another thing we can point to in explaining why he didn't quite make it in his race for the presidency against one John F. Kennedy. Now, speaking of Kennedy and Nixon, we have up here the helicopter that Nixon famously exited the White House aboard, and we'll get a look at that. So a lot of people know that scene where Nixon is throwing up his V finger symbol as he leaves for the last time. So let's get a look at it. It's probably in need of a paint job, but definitely an important piece of American history, receiving some care and attention this morning. Trying not to make a scene, as there will be other visitors, but we have now in our story reached a very interesting part of Nixon's life, sometimes called the wilderness years. And the wilderness was Nixon's now lost narrowly against Kennedy, and he makes another unfortunate decision in trying to figure out what's his life going to be like from here. He decides to run for governor of California. And his heart just wasn't really in it, and he was not well matched against his opponent, and ended up losing that governor's race by a significant margin. And so now he's really in one of the deepest valleys of his career, and he's kind of starting to appear to not only as the public, but also within his party, and of course portrayed in the media as a loser. He has now lost the presidency. He's also lost his run for governor, and he basically admits as much to the press when, after his governor attempt did not work out, he said, "You will not have Nixon to kick around anymore," meaning that he would likely just fade away. And during the wilderness, he did argue a case before the Supreme Court, but as you can see, things are heading down rather than up, and he's no longer really being seen as this up-and-coming future president. So his big comeback would come in 1968 when he ran for a second time for the presidency against kind of a weak opponent, and that was a guy named Hubert Humphrey, who was somewhat stained by the Vietnam War, and also kind of like Nixon, he was not a charismatic person the way that a Kennedy was. And so Nixon and Humphrey were kind of similar, even though they belonged to opposite parties. And Nixon was able to eke out a victory in that case, although Humphrey was really gaining pretty quickly towards the end of the campaign. And had it gone on for another week, there are those that pose Nixon may have actually lost again, but he did manage to hold on to enough votes to be able to finally win the presidency. And now we'll enter into the museum area to see the sights that everybody's here to see.
You may have noticed at the start of the clip there was a person who was prepping the presidential gravestone for the day and doing a voiceover because something happened to the audio here, but this is indeed the birthplace and childhood home of Richard Nixon. Kind of a weird sun angle, but hopefully you can take a look there at the house, which they oftentimes call it a kit house. And they don't know exactly what kit it was, but apparently the plans as well as the materials would be essentially all planned out, and then Nixon's dad would have put this house together. And I did take a tour of the interior. I'll let you stop by and do that for yourself, but still a pretty solid construction inside there. And Richard was the only of the boys to be born in the house, apparently due to some kind of inclement weather on the day of that birth.
And it looks like the morning polish for the Nixon family graves has completed. So that's the house where he was born. And right over here we have, off on the side, both Richard Nixon, 1913 to 1994, as well as former First Lady Patricia Nixon. And her grave reads, "Even when people can't speak your language, they can tell if you have love in your heart." And his gravestone reads, "The greatest honor history can bestow is the title of peacemaker." So that's what this outdoor area on the old lemon ranch looks like today. Let's see if we can continue our story in the museum. Well, there were many important aspects to the presidency prior to Watergate, and Nixon served a full term before Watergate ever really became an issue. One of the huge issues of his years in office was, of course, Vietnam and all of the social upheaval that surrounded that war, and Nixon's efforts to end the war forcefully. And so he was the first president that I'm aware of to take an approach which I believe he kind of termed the madman approach, which was he kind of encouraged the people around him, Kissinger et al., to portray him to the other side as being sort of a madman who we just don't know what he's going to do. We can't, he could do anything. And giving that kind of impression to those that you were trying to reach a settlement with. One of the biggest events that Nixon prior to Watergate was so recognized for was what they called the opening of China. And this was when he traveled to China to essentially establish a new era of relations between the two countries, in which China would go on to be very economically successful in selling goods to the US and the rest of the outside world. And the sort of isolation of China would come to an end as the United States began to rely much more on China for all the products that we bought, and China would rely much more on the outside world to sell all of those products to. Here you can see Nixon very smiley pre-Watergate with his wife Pat and their 3 dogs. So this was a dog-loving family. This right here is Pasha, who you can maybe see a little better in this picture. Pasha is just having that wind catch her hair perfectly. This was Vicky, and that was King Timahoe, otherwise known as Tim. So those are the Nixons as dog lovers as well as bowling. As we enter the Watergate portion of the museum, I want to close this Nixon before Watergate story by simply boiling down what I believe the Nixon personality was, which was something along the lines of kind of a thrill when the dice are in the air, perhaps having a bit of a self-destructive streak somewhere deep down inside, where perhaps there was just no off button and he had to just push things to their ultimate, which would oftentimes lead, in the case of Watergate, to great tragedy in his life. Once again, he would go from the highest mountain to the deepest valley.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Yeah.
Mr. Klein Dietz, Mr. President.
Hi, Mr. President. Hi, Dick. How are you? Good. How are you, sir? Fine, fine. I'm going to talk to John tomorrow about my general attitude on antitrust. And in the meantime, I know that he has left with you the IT&T thing, because apparently he says he had something to do with them once. Well, I have nothing to do with them, and I want something clearly understood. And if it is not understood, McLaren's ass is to be out within 1 hour. The IT&T thing, stay the hell out of it. Is that clear? That's an order.
You mean the order is to...
The order is to leave the goddamn thing alone. Now, I've said this, Dick, a number of times, and you fellas apparently don't get the message over there. I do not want McLaren to run around prosecuting people, raising hell about conglomerates, stirring things up at this point. Now, you're keeping the hell out of that. Is that clear?
Well, Mr. President...
Or either he resigns. I'd rather have him out anyway. I don't like the son of a bitch.
The question that is...
The question is, I know that the jurisdiction... I know all the legal things, Dick. You don't have to spell out the legal...
appeal file.
That's right.
A brief has to be filed tomorrow.
That's right. Don't file the brief.
Your order is not to file a brief.
My order is to drop the goddamn thing. Is that clear?
Yeah, I understand.
Okay.